Good evening. I thought a lot about what I would speak about tonight. Particularly, I thought about the consequences of me coming out here and talking about race. Raise your hand if you've ever had a dinner party and decided that the topic of conversation would be race. Anyone? I have to know exactly what that conversation was and how those parties came about. But ordinarily, it's just not a topic that people love to talk about. And so for me, in deciding what I would talk about and in researching this topic, I wanted to think back to the first moment I knew I was Black. Well, now you all are confused. I mean, the first moment I knew that I was Black and that some folks didn't think that was good. So I thought about kindergarten. I went to kindergarten, and I remember one day a kid named Bobby came up to me and he said, "Ashley, we've been thinking, are you the princess of Jamaica?" And I was like, well, I don't know. Let me consider this. I go back home and I tell my parents this, and actually I remember, kindergarten kids have a big imagination, so I had a Cinderella-esque imagination myself. When they called me the princess of anywhere, I did not have a problem with that, okay? So I'm like, okay, well, it wasn't kindergarten. Kindergarten was fine. I was royalty, no big deal. So then we go further on, and it was in high school, I did debate. Now, no surprise there, because I'm a lawyer, so I've been talking all my life. I did debate in high school, and I remember going to a competition, and my favorite part of debate was cross-examination. So I know all of you are gonna go home and pray for my husband tonight, because that was what I loved to do. It was one particular cross-examination against a guy, it was a white boy, and he was so upset after my cross-examination that I remember him picking up a garbage can and throwing it at me. He missed. Wasn't good at debate, wasn't good at throwing. But I remember thinking, why was he so upset? But I didn't jump to the conclusion that it's because he was beat by a Black woman. I thought it was just because he was beat. And even then, I don't remember being extraordinarily offended. I just remember winning. So it wasn't then either. So we go a little bit further in high school. I'm obviously resilient, okay? We go a little bit further in high school, and it was another debate competition, and this time it was against a white girl. She was so upset that she lost, that she called me a N-word, beep. I don't know if there are kids here. And we're gonna put this on YouTube, and we're not gonna get you all censored off. That's what she called me, so use your imagination. Now that time, I knew she was mad because I was Black, I was a woman, and she lost. And I remember having this conversation with my parents, and they're here tonight, and what I recall the most from talking to them, and I don't remember the exact words, but it was, keep on winning. Period. Keep on winning. So my perspective as a Black woman in corporate America, and I write on diversity issues, so I get stories from all around the country of other Black women who are dealing with insecurities in their workplaces, and they don't talk to me about the numbers, they talk to me about how they feel alone, how they feel discredited, and guess what? I always ask, well, have you talked to anyone at your company? And they always say no. So it means that most people are suffering in some silence. Now, the way that I grew up is not ordinary. I had both parents in the home, that's a privilege. I was raised to be confident, that's a privilege. My parents went to college, that's a privilege. I don't know why white people don't like white privilege. My privileges were positive and I take them, you know what I mean? But hey, do what you gotta do. But I grew up with privileges, and as a Black woman, I can say that. So hopefully I can help my white sisters out. Not a big deal. You admit it, you move on. I know those are privileges, and when I talk to other women who need help navigating the corporate sphere, I say, look, I grew up with these privileges, but what you can duplicate from how I've been able to navigate corporate with my confidence is skip the figures, skip the facts, skip the things that say, we've all heard negative numbers tonight, and if you notice at the end of some of the speeches, they say, and for Black people, it is insert worse. Skip the figures. Focus on how you can make yourself feel better. And every corporation that I work with, if they really care about diversity, we will talk about the numbers because your board members need it, but I want to get to the root of how your people feel. In preparation for this speech, I decided to do my own social scientist survey. And I did it like yesterday, so I didn't have a lot of time. Real scientists, don't be mad. And how did I do it? Via social media. I'm a millennial, right? I was like, I need 200 responses. It's a 2-question survey, and I'm not gonna take your name or email, so don't worry, I won't spam you or ask you for money later. We got 270 responses within hours. The first question I asked was, do you feel that corporations in America care about the promotion of racially diverse individuals? 70% of respondents said no. Now, let me be clear. The answers were yes, no, or maybe. I gave the maybe only because I know some people are like, but there's this one company somewhere that does this one thing and it's really good and I know that it's gonna make an impact, so I gave the maybe for the people like that, no problem. So 70% of people said no. Less than 5% of respondents said yes. The rest of them said maybe. One of my maybe friends is here. And what's so interesting is I didn't give them a space to say explain, but the messages that I got were the explanations. And the stories that I heard are the stories that those figures will never tell you. And it's so interesting because I went to Northwestern Law and we had this class and it was on diversity in the law, because we all know how amazing that is, right? So I went to that class week after week, but one particular class, they had us read all these surveys, and it was about the state of America, and it was about how Black boys are more likely to be shot by police under the age of 10 because cops will perceive them as being 16 and over. It was about how Black women are more likely to die during childbirth for any number of reasons, one of them being when doctors were surveyed, no shade to any of the doctors here, they believed that Black women actually had tougher skin and could take more pain than their non-racially diverse counterparts. Crazy, right? But you know what study wasn't done? There were no studies that said the benefits of being a first-generation college member and then going on to run a Fortune 500 corporation. There were no studies done about how you are able to survive and be one of the only ones in a classroom filled with people that don't look like you, and how that experience can actually enhance a corporation's culture. There are no studies done about the actual benefits and the resilience that you earn by being a minority. I wonder why. Because as a minority who went to Northwestern Law, and was not well represented, and then went on to one of the largest, most profitable law firms in Chicago, I would have read every single one of those studies, and I would have looked at every single trend so that I could know exactly how to not just survive in corporate America, but to thrive. But those studies have not been done as of yet. So when I say ignore the facts or ignore the figures that are out there, it's only because the research only studies the inadequacies of these populations, but not necessarily the resilience that results when you do make it. And that's the data we need to encourage all of the students coming up after us. I still get letters from girls who say I'm the first Black lawyer they've met in 2019. I mean, Olivia Pope is not a real lawyer. And Claire Huxtable, she's my girl, but she's not a real lawyer. So they mean like barred lawyer can actually represent clients. And it's a problem because it's that representation that can change the dynamic of the racial conversations. So I remember in high school, that was the moment that I knew, okay, I'm Black, and for some people that's a problem. But in my household, it was always seen as positive. Like, Ashley, you're different, you have a big personality, this is gonna be the thing that like champions are made of. So when I would go into environments and they would reject who I am because of my color, I'd be like, y'all tripping. You are missing out on this Black brilliance over here. Who told you Black isn't good, girl? So that was like me, right? But for people who aren't reaffirmed for the first 18 years of their life by family members and friends, who don't have aunts who are lawyers, who don't have parents who are married, my aunt and uncle are married, when they would say things like, I would get questions like, do you know your dad? I'm like, my dad? He's at home. Like, yeah, I know my dad, you know what I mean? I recently went to the doctor's office and I was going to my OBGYN and she was like, well, are you a single woman? I was like, well, that's an odd question. What made you ask that? That totally took her off guard. I mean, she immediately was like, oh. And so one of the ways that I've been able to have, because the thing is this, right? People say talk is cheap, but conversation is expensive. Talk may be cheap, but conversation is expensive. Not only is it expensive, everything that's expensive means that it's inaccessible to everyone. Which means a lot of times people don't have conversations with people that are different from them because they're just not in rooms like that. Because not only do you have to be an African American in the room where you're the only one, but then you have to be brave enough to have the conversations that most aren't willing to have. Mind you, my confidence was built over 18 years. It would have been really hard for me to go into corporate America and they just totally wreck my confidence. I was not going, okay? Be that as it may. I vividly remember on my first day of corporate America at Kirkwood and Ellis, a law firm in Chicago, walking the halls, and everyone that was African American that I saw at first worked in the building, but they weren't necessarily attorneys. But every single time I walked through those halls, I remember saying to myself, you're brilliant, you deserve to be here, you're going to be yourself here. It was a deliberate decision. And at the point they can't handle who you are, you're going to leave here and go do something else that's brilliant. But these are deliberate decisions, and these are conversations that I had to have on top of doing all the work that was required. I also was brave enough to have some conversations in the various companies that I worked at that everyone doesn't have the framework to have. Oftentimes, racial conversations like this aren't filled with laughter, so thank you guys for laughing. They're typically not. They're filled with blame. When privilege is talked about, it's talked about as white privilege, bad thing. But notice I talked about my privileges first. That was on purpose, though, to get everyone comfortable enough to think, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe these conversations aren't so hard, and you want to know how we have them with purpose, how we have them in a way that can move the racial conversation forward? Using that silence thing we learned about earlier. Love. It's love. Now, I'm not saying go in tomorrow and hug your boss. Do not touch anyone. That is not okay. I used to be an employment lawyer. Please do not keep your hands to yourself. Love is a framework by which you can have a forward-moving conversation, and the L stands for listening. Studies show that only 10% of us actually are able to listen, and the reason is because the average person can talk 124 words per minute. Now, my husband will tell you I'm way above average. But because of that, our brains think much faster. And so we listen to things, but then we go inside ourselves to think about it and also figure out our response. But you have to truly listen. When we have tough conversations, like conversations about race, our working memory, the part of our brain that actually deals with reasoning and comprehension and all of those types of skills, problem solving, actually decreases because it believes that it's about to be a stressful conversation. So before having these conversations, you absolutely have to think about how you're gonna listen. Raise your hand if you took a listening class in school. A few of us, but not many. It's pretty rare. And listening is a skill that can be developed. So that's the L in love. The O is being open-minded. Open-minded individuals have what's called intellectual humility. They're able to be willing to change their opinion, but they're wise enough to know when it's not appropriate to do so. The V in love stands for validate. And I want to be really clear here. We're talking about validating the person regardless of the perspective. What we see today on television, politics, is wholesale invalidation. We meet someone, they're a Republican, they're bad, or good, depending on where you stand. I don't know your tax bracket, but we have to be willing to validate the person regardless of the opinion. There's a man, Mr. Davis, he's a black man who's been able to convert over 200 Klansmen, or been able to convince 200 Klansmen to leave the Klan because he became friends with them after going to their meetings and finding commonality. He used love against hate. The last part of the love theory is empathy. Being able to feel what someone else is, understand what someone else is feeling from their perspective. There's actually some studies that show people with high empathy are able to understand how you're feeling based on your history and your biology. Here's the thing. A lot of people are understandably angry, which is why the race conversation is tough, and I get it. The reason why I'm a proponent of love versus anger in tough conversations is because when you get angry, you have a higher probability of having health problems. Uncontrolled anger, did you know that people who have uncontrolled anger, if they happen to cut themselves or fall into some type of an accident, their wounds heal slower than those who have a perpetual state of peace? You're not giving people love for them, you're doing it for you. And in the process, you can change who they are as well. So I want us to reimagine the race conversation. When it comes up and it's getting heated, try to crack a joke, admit something that you may have done wrong, but more importantly, find out how they're feeling, look past the facts that they're presenting, listen, be open-minded, validate the person, and show empathy. Loved speaking with you all tonight.